The silver blade didn't tremble in Clara's hand, but the world around her seemed to vibrate with a predatory hum that made the very marrow in her bones feel cold. She wasn't supposed to be in the East Wing. No one was. The heavy, gold-leafed doors of the king's private sanctum were whispered to be a threshold between the living and a silence so ancient it could swallow a soul whole. But as the moonlight bled through the arched lancet windows of the corridor, casting long skeletal shadows across the stone floor, Clara felt the pull, a jagged magnetic tug in the center of her chest that defied every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She pressed her ear to the cold wood and for a heartbeat there was nothing. Then a sound that shattered her reality. A sob. Not a roar of a monster, not the hiss of a nocturnal ruler, but the raw, ragged sound of a man breaking apart in the dark. In that moment the terrifying myth of the vampire king cracked, and Clara realized that the danger wasn't just what he was. It was the devastating humanity he was hiding from the world. Hello to all of you beautiful souls joining us today. It is so wonderful to have you back in our storytelling corner. Before we dive deeper into the shadows of the king's castle, I'd love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And how are you truly doing today? I hope you're feeling inspired and ready for a journey. If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support means the world to me and helps us keep these emotional stories alive. Now let's go back to that darkened hallway, where a secret is about to breathe its first breath of moonlight. Clara Ripley stood frozen, her breath hitching in the stagnant, incense-heavy air. She was a girl defined by her invisibility, a quiet scholar brought to the citadel to catalog the king's sprawling, dust-choked library, yet here she was playing the spy. The king, known only to the public as Silas Vanderbilt, was a name that commanded silence in the streets of the city below. They said he had ruled for 3 centuries without ever aging, without ever showing a hint of weakness, and without ever letting a single soul pass the ironclad gates of his inner life. He was a statue of ice and authority. But the sound coming from behind that door was liquid fire. As Clara's fingers brushed the latch, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. A frost crawled up the tapestries, turning the depictions of ancient battles into crystalline nightmares. She knew she should run. The punishment for trespassing in the sovereign's quarters was not mere exile. It was a disappearance so permanent that even the records of your birth would be erased. Yet that pull in her chest, that heart-bound tether she couldn't explain, tightened. It felt as though her own pulse was syncing with the heavy rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the doorframe. She pushed. The door didn't creak. It yielded with a heavy velvet sigh. The room beyond was bathed in an unnatural violet luminescence. It wasn't candles or lamps, but a glow emanating from a shattered mirror at the far end of the chamber. Shards of glass lay scattered like diamonds across a floor stained with something dark and viscous. Standing in the center of the wreckage was Silas. He wasn't wearing his royal regalia or the stiff, high-collared coats the public saw. He was in a translucent white shirt torn at the shoulder, his skin so pale it looked like polished marble under the moon. He didn't turn around, but his voice sliced through the silence like a razor. "You were told the price of entry, Clara Ripley. Why have you come to collect your death so early?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She didn't drop the silver letter opener she'd taken for protection, but she didn't raise it either. "I didn't come to hurt you," she whispered, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the room. "I heard you. I heard the pain." Silas spun around then, and the air left Clara's lungs. His eyes weren't the calculated, predatory red of the legends. They were a swirling, tortured amber, brimming with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her. In his hand he clutched a small leather-bound journal that looked centuries old, its pages charred at the edges. Behind him, the shattered mirror didn't show his reflection. It showed a flicker of a different time, a woman who looked hauntingly like Clara, standing in a field of burning roses. "You see too much," Silas hissed, his fangs lengthening, a predatory grace returning to his limbs as he blurred across the room, pinning Clara against the stone wall before she could even blink. His grip on her shoulders was firm, but notably he didn't crush her. His face was inches from hers, his breath cold as winter wind, yet smelling of sandalwood and ancient rain. "You see the cracks in the king, and for that I should drain the curiosity from your veins." Clara looked up at him, refusing to blink, refusing to let the terror win. She saw the way his hands trembled against her skin. She saw the secret bleeding out of his eyes. The secret that he wasn't just a king, but a prisoner of a history he couldn't outrun. "Then do it," she challenged, her voice steadying. "But you'll still be alone with whatever is in that book. And I think that's what you're actually afraid of." Silas froze. The amber in his eyes flickered, the predatory mask slipping just enough for Clara to see the man beneath the monster. For a second, the silence was absolute, a precarious bridge between a violent end and a dangerous beginning. Then the king did something he hadn't done in 200 years. He let go. He stepped back, his shoulders slumped, and he looked at the girl who shouldn't be there, yet felt like the only person who had ever truly seen him. "The bloodline is cursed, Clara," he whispered, a revelation that felt like a death sentence. "And by stepping into this room you've just woven yourself into the noose." The silence that followed Silas's confession was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. Clara didn't flee, she stayed anchored to the spot, her eyes tracing the jagged lines of the shattered mirror. She was a woman who had spent her life among the dead, at least the paper versions of them. Raised in the quiet academic halls of the great library, Clara Ripley was used to things that stayed still, things that could be categorized and filed away. But Silas Vanderbilt was a living storm, a man who existed in the violent intersection of history and myth. A curse. Clara's voice was barely a breath, but in the echoing chamber, it sounded like a thunderclap. She watched him move back to the center of the room, his movements no longer those of a predator, but of a man burdened by an invisible suit of armor. "You've ruled for centuries. The world sees strength, Silas. They see an empire built on your shadow." Silas let out a dry, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Strength is the mask we wear when the truth is too grotesque to show. You see a king, I see a caretaker of a graveyard. Every member of my line who has ever sat on this throne has eventually withered. Not from age but from the weight of the memories." He turned the leather-bound journal over in his hands. It was the Vanderbilt Ledger, a book rumored to contain the names of every soul the bloodline had ever claimed, but Clara suspected it held something far more intimate. Clara took a tentative step forward. She noticed the way his hands were scarred, thin silver lines that looked like lightning strikes across his knuckles. They weren't battle wounds. They were the marks of a man who had fought himself and lost. She felt a surge of empathy so sharp it physically hurt. She knew what it was like to be the keeper of things no one wanted to remember. Since her parents had passed, leaving her with nothing but a trunk of old letters and a thirst for forbidden knowledge, she had been a ghost in her own life. "I know what it's like to be defined by what you hide," she said softly, reaching out as if to touch the air between them. "But keeping it locked in this room is killing you. I can see it. The way the frost follows you. It's not power, Silas. It's your own spirit freezing over." Before he could respond, the heavy doors at the end of the hall groaned open, and a man stepped into the threshold. This was Julian Sterling, Silas's most trusted advisor and the captain of the Royal Guard. Julian was everything Silas was not: broad-shouldered, warm-blooded, and radiating a protective, almost paternal energy. He took in the scene, the shattered glass, the girl, the king's disarray, with a look of practiced neutrality that couldn't quite hide the flash of alarm in his eyes. "Your Majesty," Julian said, his voice deep and grounding. "The council is asking for the midnight report. They are growing restless about the whispers of instability." Silas straightened his posture instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of cold granite. The king was back. "Tell them I am occupied, Julian. And take Miss Ripley back to her quarters. She has wandered far beyond her map." Julian's gaze flickered to Clara, a silent warning passing between them. He had known Clara since she arrived at the Citadel, and while he admired her intellect, he clearly feared her curiosity would be her undoing. He stepped toward her, his hand hovering near her elbow, but he didn't touch her. "Clara," he whispered, "come away. This room is a tomb for a reason." As Julian led her toward the door, Clara looked back one last time. Silas was standing by the window, the purple light of the broken mirror illuminating the back of his shirt. He looked like a god of old, lonely and terrible. But it was the journal he held, the way he gripped it as if it were a lifeline, that stayed with her. Back in the safety of the library, the scent of old parchment usually calmed her, but tonight the air felt thin. She sat at her mahogany desk, surrounded by the genealogies of the Vanderbilt family she had been hired to sort. Her mind was racing. If the bloodline was cursed, why did she feel a pull toward him that felt like destiny rather than a death sentence? Why did her heart beat in time with his? She pulled a heavy tome from the shelf, the Ledger of the Heartbound, an obscure text she had hidden under her bed weeks ago. It spoke of souls that were fractured in one life and sought their missing pieces in another. It spoke of a bond that could break even the most ancient of curses, but only if the blood was shared willingly. As she turned the page, a pressed flower fell out, a rose black as night, yet perfectly preserved. It was the same flower she had seen in the vision in the shattered mirror. Her breath caught. The woman in the mirror wasn't just a resemblance, she was a precursor. Clara realized then that she wasn't just a cataloger. She was a piece of a puzzle that Silas had been trying to solve for 300 years. And the secrets he guarded weren't just about his power. They were about a love that had once brought the world to its knees, and a betrayal that had frozen his heart in time. She looked out the library window toward the high spire of the East Wing. She knew that by tomorrow, Silas would likely try to erase her memory or banish her from the citadel. But the bond, the heartbound link, was already active. She could feel his coldness in her fingertips, and she knew with a certainty that terrified her, that she was the only one who could bring the spring back to his winter. "I'm not leaving you in the dark, Silas," she whispered to the empty room. "Even if I have to burn with you to see the light." In the shadows of the library's corner, a figure shifted. Not Julian. Not Silas. Something ancient, something that had been watching the Vanderbilt line for centuries, waiting for the one girl who could finally break the seal. A low, guttural hiss echoed in the rafters, a sound of hunger and ancient enmity. The king's secrets were no longer just his to keep, they were now a target. The following morning, the citadel was draped in a thick, unnatural fog that tasted of ozone and ancient iron. Clara hadn't slept. The image of the black rose and the tortured amber of Silas's eyes had burned themselves into her mind. She was at her desk, feverishly cross-referencing the Vanderbilt genealogy with the Ledger of the Heartbound, when the library's heavy oak doors were thrown open with such force they hit the stone walls with a crack like a bone breaking. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't Silas. A woman strode in, her presence like a blade of ice cutting through the warmth of the library. She was tall, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that seemed to swallow the light, her hair a shock of silver-white pinned back with a comb carved from human bone. This was Elena Thorne, the matriarch of the council and the oldest living vampire in the kingdom, aside from Silas himself. Her eyes, a predatory, milky violet, scanned the room before settling on Clara with a terrifying intensity. "So," Elena purred, her voice a low, melodic threat. "The little mouse who found the crack in the mountain. I wondered what kind of girl would be foolish enough to walk into the king's despair and think she found a treasure." Clara stood, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she didn't lower her gaze. "I'm a cataloger, Lady Thorne. I was simply doing my job when I heard." "You heard a weakness," Elena interrupted, moving with a blurring speed that left Clara pinned against her desk before she could draw a breath. Elena's hand, cold as a winter grave, clamped around Clara's throat, not enough to choke, but enough to remind her how fragile her life was. "Silas thinks he is protecting this bloodline by hiding. He thinks that if he stays in the dark the rot won't spread. But the council is tired of a king who weeps in the shadows. We need the beast, not the man." "He's not a beast," Clara gasped, her fingers clawing at Elena's iron grip. "Isn't he?" Elena laughed, and the sound was like glass grinding together. "He hasn't told you the truth of the heartbound bond, has he? It's not a fairy tale, girl. It's a tether. If he claims you, your life becomes the fuel for his immortality. You don't save him. You sustain him until there is nothing left of you but a husk." With a sudden, violent shove, Elena released her. Clara stumbled back, gasping for air, her eyes landing on the black rose she had found in the book. Elena's gaze followed hers, and for the first time the vampire's composure cracked. A look of genuine, visceral fear crossed her face. "Where did you get that?" Elena hissed, her hand trembling as she pointed at the flower. "That rose died 300 years ago. It only blooms when the curse is ready to claim a new sacrifice." Before Clara could answer, the library windows shattered inward. A gust of wind, smelling of sulfur and wet earth, tore through the room. From the swirling fog, figures emerged. Not vampires but something older, something primal. They were the hollowed, ancient revenants of a rival bloodline that the Vanderbilts were supposed to have eradicated centuries ago. They were gray-skinned, their eyes vacant pits of darkness, and they moved with a jerky, unnatural hunger. "The seal is broken," Elena screamed, drawing a curved dagger from her sleeve. "Silas, you fool. You let her in and you let the gate open." The lead hollowed lunged toward Clara, its claws extended like obsidian needles. Clara scrambled back, grabbing the only weapon she had, the silver letter opener, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature's breath was a foul rot, and as its shadow fell over her, she felt the heartbound pull in her chest flare into a white-hot agony. "Silas." The word wasn't a whisper. It was a scream in her mind. In a burst of violet light and shattering stone, the ceiling above the library's central rotunda exploded. Silas descended like a fallen angel, his coat billowing like wings of shadow. He didn't land, he struck. He hit the lead hollowed with such force that the creature was instantly reduced to a pile of gray ash. He stood before Clara, his back to her, his entire body vibrating with a suppressed, violent energy. He wasn't the man who had sobbed in the dark last night. He was the king. He was the monster the world feared. "Get behind me," Silas commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the floorboards beneath Clara's feet tremble. "Silas, they're here for her," Elena shouted, retreating toward the door. "The Hollowed don't want the throne, they want the tether. If they kill her before the bond is sealed, the Vanderbilt line ends today." Silas turned his head just enough for Clara to see his profile. His eyes were no longer amber, they were a burning, incandescent gold. "They will have to walk through the fire of 1,000 suns before they touch her." He reached back, his hand finding Clara's. The moment their skin touched, a shockwave of energy rippled through the library, blowing the rest of the windows outward and sending the remaining hollowed reeling. Clara felt a surge of power, not her own but his, flowing into her, an ancient, intoxicating heat that made the fear vanish. But then the twist. The lead hollowed, the one Silas had turned to ash, began to reform. The ash swirled, knitting back together into the shape of a man. But as the face took form, Clara felt the world tilt. It wasn't a monster. It was a face she recognized from the back of an old locket her mother had left her. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking. The creature smiled, a jagged, horrific expression. "The king didn't tell you, Clara? Your blood isn't just a key. It's the ransom for every soul he's ever stolen. Including mine." Silas's grip on her hand tightened until it was painful. He looked at the creature, then back at Clara, a look of devastating realization dawning on his face. He had to choose: kill the creature that wore her father's face and seal the bond, or let the Hollowed take her and save his own soul from the guilt of another murder. "Clara," Silas choked out, his golden eyes flickering back to tortured amber. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know he was one of them." The Hollowed lunged again, but this time it wasn't aiming for Silas. It was aiming for the black rose on the desk. If the flower was destroyed, the tether would snap, and both Clara and Silas would be lost to the darkness forever. The library had become a battlefield of ghosts and shadows. As the creature wearing her father's face lunged for the black rose, Silas moved with a speed that defied human perception. He intercepted the Hollowed mid-air, slamming it into a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. Thousands of ancient texts rained down like heavy leather-bound hail, burying the monster in a mountain of forgotten history. "Julian!" Silas roared. As if summoned by the sheer force of the king's will, Julian Sterling burst through the debris, his twin silver sabers already drawn and glowing with an ethereal blue light. He didn't ask questions. He saw the Hollowed and immediately began a rhythmic, deadly dance of steel, keeping the remaining gray-skinned revenants at bay. "Take her to the Solaris Tower," Julian shouted over the din of clashing metal. "The sun will be up in 3 hours. If she's not behind the gold-veined walls by then, the Hollowed will send her blood across the entire continent." Silas didn't waste a second. He swept Clara into his arms. The sensation was jarring, he was as cold as marble, yet the place where her body pressed against his felt like a brand. He leaped through the shattered rotunda, ascending the outside of the citadel's spire with terrifying grace. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy, until she felt her feet touch solid ground again. They were in the Solaris Tower, a sanctuary of white stone and gilded glass designed to amplify the rays of the sun. Silas set her down, his chest heaving. For the first time Clara saw him in the light. His shirt was soaked with a black oily substance, the blood of the hollowed, and his hands were shaking. "That thing," Clara gasped, her voice trembling. "It had my father's eyes, Silas." "How is that possible?" "My father died in a shipwreck 12 years ago." Silas turned away, pacing the circular room like a caged panther. "The hollowed don't just kill, Clara. They consume the essence of those who die with Vanderbilt on their lips. Your father was a scholar, wasn't he? A man who hunted for the same ledger you were cataloging? He found a secret he shouldn't have, and the hollowed used his soul as a vessel. They are using your grief as a homing beacon." "You knew him," she realized, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "That's why you hired me. It wasn't because of my skills. You wanted to see if the daughter carried the same heartbound spark as the man who almost exposed you." Silas stopped pacing. He looked at her, and the raw honesty in his gaze was more intimate than any touch. "I hired you because I was a coward, Clara. I thought if I kept you close I could control the narrative. I thought I could prevent the curse from waking up. I didn't expect." He paused, his voice dropping to a low, melodic vibration. "I didn't expect to find a soul that hummed the same melody as mine." The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just about the monsters outside. It was about the magnetic, forbidden pull between the two of them. Claire took a step toward him. "Elena said the bond would kill me. She said I'm just fuel for your immortality." "She's right," Silas whispered, though he didn't move away as she approached. "The Vanderbilt line is a parasite. We survive by tethering ourselves to the brightest souls we can find. If I seal this bond, I will live for another 5 centuries, and you will fade. I would be a monster to ask that of you. And if you don't seal it? Then the hollowed win. The Vanderbilt line ends, the city falls to the gray rot, and I finally get the rest I've been craving for 300 years. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold skin of his cheek. To her surprise, he didn't flinch. He leaned into her hand, a soft, broken sound escaping his throat. "You speak of duty and curses," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "But what about what we want? I've felt alone my entire life, Silas. Even before my father died, I was a girl looking for a home that didn't exist. When I looked into that shattered mirror last night, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who chose you." The air between them seemed to thicken, a growing attraction that was as dangerous as the creatures circling the tower below. Silas's golden eyes searched hers, looking for fear and finding only a defiant, glowing heat. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You are a flame in a house made of ice, Clara Ripley," he murmured. Suddenly the tower groaned. The gold-veined walls began to hairline fracture. Below them, in the courtyard, a low, rhythmic drumming started. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of the hollowed marching in unison, their voices rising in a discordant chant that made Clara's ears bleed. "They're early," Silas hissed, his face hardening. "The sun is still hours away. They've found a way to bypass the Solaris wards." He turned toward the balcony, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait. If they want me because of my blood, then we use it. We lead them away from the city." "No," Silas barked. "I will not use you as bait." "It's not bait if I'm the one holding the line," Clara countered. She remembered a passage from the Ledger of the Heartbound, about a red herring, a way to trick the hollowed by mimicking the bond's frequency. There's a way to create a false tether. If we can lead them to the sun-drenched cliffs, the first light of dawn will incinerate them. "It's a suicide mission," Silas said, but there was a flicker of hope and admiration in his eyes. "It's a choice," she corrected. "By choice." As they prepared to descend back into the chaos, a shadow moved across the moon. A massive, winged shape, far larger than any vampire, began to circle the tower. The hollowed had a leader, and it was something that Silas hadn't seen in an age. The tension reached a fever pitch as the doors to the tower were blasted inward, not by force, but by a psychic wave of pure, unadulterated despair. Silas stepped in front of Clara, his fangs fully extended, his body a shield of dark power. "Stay close, Clara. If we survive this, I'm taking you as far from this curse as the world allows." Don't make promises to a girl who likes to break rules, Silas, she whispered, a small, brave smile playing on her lips. Before they could move, a voice echoed through the room. Not her father's this time, but a voice that sounded like 1,000 dead leaves skittering on stone. The king thinks he can hide his heart in a tower. But hearts were made to be broken. The psychic wave of despair hit Clara like a physical blow, forcing her to her knees. Silas let out a guttural roar, his power flaring to form a shimmering violet barrier between them and the shattered doorway. But the voice, the one that sounded like dead leaves, didn't come from the hallway. It came from the shadows within the room itself. Slowly, the silver-white hair and midnight blue gown of Elena Thorne emerged from the darkness of a corner she should not have been able to occupy. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her was Julian Sterling, his blue glowing sabers sheathed, his head bowed in a way that didn't signal respect but submission. "Julian." Clara gasped, her heart sinking. "What are you doing?" "He's doing what is necessary for the survival of the realm, child," Elena said, her violet eyes glowing with a treacherous light. She held a small obsidian vial in her hand, filled with a liquid that pulsed like a dying star. "Silas has spent 3 centuries convinced that the Vanderbilt curse was a tragedy of fate. He told you it was a parasite, didn't he? That he would drain you to stay alive." Silas snarled, stepping toward them, but his movements were sluggish. He looked down at his hands, where the black oily blood of the hollowed was beginning to seep into his skin rather than drying. "What have you done, Elena?" "The hollowed aren't your enemies, Silas. They are your ancestors," Elena revealed, the words hitting the room like a localized earthquake. "The curse isn't that you drained the Heartbound. The revelation you've been too terrified to face is that the Vanderbilt line created the hollowed. Every king before you didn't wither away. They became the very monsters you see at the gates because they refused to let go of their power. They sacrificed their humanity to remain untouchable." Clara watched in horror as Silas stumbled. The midpoint revelation was a game-changer that shattered everything she had come to believe. Silas wasn't the victim of an ancient malady. He was the latest vessel for a legacy of intentional, calculated evil. "And you," Elena said, turning her predatory gaze to Clara. "You aren't his savior. You are the final ingredient. The Vanderbilt ledger isn't a history book, it's a blueprint. To stop the transition into a hollowed king, the blood of a descendant of the first scholar, your father's line, must be poured into the king's heart. But not to sustain him. To end him." Clara's world tilted. "To end him." "Julian," Elena commanded. Julian finally looked up and Clara saw the tears tracking through the dust on his face. "I'm sorry, Clara. The council decided. If Silas becomes a hollowed king, the world burns. If he dies tonight, the lineage ends and the hollowed dissolve. It's the only way to save the city." The betrayal was a jagged blade in Clara's chest. The man she had started to trust, the one she felt heartbound to, was either a monster in waiting or a man marked for execution by his own friends. Silas looked at Clara, his amber eyes wide with a shared vulnerability that transcended the chaos. For a moment the king was gone, replaced by the man who had sobbed in the dark. He saw the obsidian vial, he saw Julian's unsheathed dagger, and he saw the choice. He could fight them, reclaim his dark birthright, and become the most powerful hollowed king in history, or he could let them kill him. "Is it true?" Clara whispered, moving towards Silas despite the danger. "Are you becoming one of them?" Silas looked at his hands, where the black veins were now climbing toward his throat. "I felt it, for years. The coldness. The hunger for the light. I thought I could fight it if I just stayed away from everyone. If I stayed in the dark." He reached out, his touch now so cold it felt like dry ice, but he cupped her face with a tenderness that broke her heart. "I brought you here to see if the stories were true. If a Heartbound could stop the change without the blood spilling. I wanted to be a man for you, Clara. Just for a day." "You are a man," she cried, her tears falling onto his marble-cold skin. "Kill him now," Elena hissed, sensing the shift in the air. As Julian stepped forward, his blade raised, the black rose on the desk began to glow with a blinding, iridescent gold. It wasn't the light of the sun, it was the light of the bond. The vulnerability they shared in that moment, the total, unshielded truth, had activated the tether in its purest form. The stakes reached their highest point yet. The tower began to vibrate as the hollowed outside screeched in agony, repelled by the sudden surge of heartbound energy. But inside, the air was thick with passion and determination. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against Silas's. "We don't follow their blueprint," she whispered fiercely. "We make our own." In that moment of absolute connection, Clara realized the third secret. The blood didn't need to be spilled, it needed to be transformed. But before she could act, Elena lunged, the obsidian vial aimed not at Silas's heart, but at Clara's throat. If the sacrifice was forced, the curse would be sealed forever in its most violent form. "No!" Silas screamed, the sound echoing with the power of 1,000 years of royalty. As he threw himself in front of Clara, the vial shattered, and the room was swallowed in a flash of black and gold. The world didn't end with a bang but with a suffocating velvet silence. As the obsidian vial shattered against Silas's chest, the liquid within, the concentrated essence of the Vanderbilt curse, didn't spill. It crawled. Like 1,000 black spiders, the ink-like substance raced across Silas's skin, weaving into his veins and turning the marble-pale surface of his body into a map of darkness. "Silas!" Clara's scream was muffled by the sudden, heavy pressure in the air. He didn't fall. He rose. But he wasn't the man she loved anymore. His body elongated, his fingers sharpening into obsidian talons, and his eyes, the beautiful tortured amber was gone, replaced by the hollow vacant pits of the transition. The darkest hour had arrived, and it had brought the king to his knees before his own inner demon. Elena Thorne stood back, a triumphant, jagged smile on her face. "It's done. The transition is irreversible. He didn't die for you, girl. He became the very thing that will consume you." The separation was more than physical. It was spiritual. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric of his shirt, but a pulse of cold energy threw her back across the room. Silas let out a sound that wasn't human, a low, rhythmic clicking that mimicked the march of the hollowed outside. He looked at Clara, but there was no recognition in his gaze. There was only a primal, ancient hunger. "Julian, finish it," Elena commanded. "The transition is weak in its first minutes. Kill the beast before it stabilizes." Julian Sterling stood frozen, his sabers trembling in his hands. He looked at Clara, lying bruised on the floor, and then at the creature that used to be his king. I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He's still in there. I can feel him fighting. He is gone." Elena shrieked, snatching a blade from Julian's belt. "If you won't save this city, I will." But as Elena lunged toward the transforming Silas, the tower walls finally gave way. The hollowed, sensing their new king's emergence, swarmed through the breaches like a tide of gray ash. They didn't attack Silas, they knelt. Thousands of them filled the courtyard and the lower levels of the tower, their discordant chanting rising into a deafening roar of "Sovereign! Sovereign!" Clara scrambled to her feet, her heart feeling like it had been shredded. She looked at the black rose, now wilted and gray on the desk. The hope that had fueled her was evaporating. She was trapped in a crumbling tower, surrounded by ancient vampires who wanted her dead and a sea of monsters waiting for their master to lead them. The situation appeared utterly hopeless. Silas, now fully encased in a shell of shifting shadow, turned toward the balcony. He let out a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the tower, a call to arms that signaled the beginning of the end for the world below. "Silas, please," Clara cried, her voice barely audible over the wind and the chanting. "Look at me. You said you were a prisoner of your memories. Don't let them become your future." The creature paused. For a fraction of a second, the obsidian mask over his face flickered, revealing a glimpse of a gold eye, not the burning gold of power but the soft, dying amber of a man drowning. "Run," a voice whispered in Clara's mind. It wasn't the dead leaves of the hollowed. It was the ragged, broken ghost of Silas. "Run, Clara, while I can still hold the door." But she couldn't run. The doors were blocked by Elena and the council's guards. The only way out was the balcony, a 100-foot drop into a courtyard filled with the hungry dead. She was separated from her love, her father's memory was a weapon used against her, and the man she risked everything for was becoming the architect of her destruction. Clara slumped against the cold stone, the weight of the despair pressing the air from her lungs. She looked at her hands, which were stained with the black residue of the vial. She had failed. The heart-bound bond wasn't a bridge. It was a tether that had pulled her down into the abyss with him. Outside, the first hint of gray light began to touch the horizon. But it wasn't the warm, saving grace of the sun. It was a cold, sickly dawn that only highlighted the carnage. In this darkest hour, as the King of Shadows prepared to take his throne, Clara Ripley realized that the only thing left to lose was her life, and she wondered if that was the only currency the curse would finally accept. The air in the Solaris Tower was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient, rotting history. Clara watched as the shadow-clad figure of Silas stood on the precipice of the balcony, his back arched as if he were trying to tear his own soul out. The transition was almost complete. Below, the hollowed were silent, a sea of gray glass waiting for the first command from their new god. "It's over, child," Elena whispered, stepping over the debris toward Clara. "The sun is rising and it will only burn what's left of him. You are the only loose end." Clara looked at the gray wilted black rose on the desk. She thought of her father's face, the version in her locket, not the monster in the library. She thought of Silas's scarred knuckles and the way he had looked at her like she was the first light he'd seen in 3 centuries. A spark of defiance, hotter than any vampire's rage, ignited in the pit of her stomach. "No," Clara said, her voice echoing with a sudden, crystalline clarity. "You said the Vanderbilt line created the Hollowed because they refused to let go of their power. You said they used the blood of the scholars to end the king. But you're wrong about the blood, Elena." Clara stood up, her eyes locked on Silas's trembling form. She remembered the hidden passage in the ledger of the Heartbound that she had barely glimpsed. The heart does not require a sacrifice of death, but a sacrifice of the self. "Julian!" Clara shouted. "The sun. Use the mirrors." Julian Sterling snapped out of his trance of despair, looked at the great solar mirror, a massive gold-plated disc at the top of the tower. It was designed to catch the very first ray of dawn and funnel it into the heart of the chamber. "It will kill him, Clara," Julian cried. "If he's in transition, the light will turn him to ash." "Not if the bond is sealed," Clara yelled back. She ran toward Silas, dodging Elena's grasp. She didn't stop until she was right behind the creature, the coldness radiating from him so intense it felt like needles in her skin. She reached out and wrapped her arms around the Shadow King's waist, pressing her heart against the jagged obsidian map of his back. "Silas, I am not your fuel. I am your anchor. If you go into the dark, you take me with you. But if you want to stay, give it all up. Give up the throne, give up the blood, give up the centuries." Silas let out a roar that was half sob, half shriek. The obsidian shell began to crack. The turning point was here. A moment of internal realization that would either unite them or destroy the world. "Julian, now," Clara commanded. With a cry of courage, Julian hauled on the rusted chains of the great solar mirror. The gears groaned, protesting centuries of stagnation, but finally they gave way. At that exact second, the first sliver of the sun broke over the horizon. A beam of pure white gold light struck the mirror and was deflected downward, hitting the center of the tower with the force of a falling star. The light didn't just illuminate the room, it scoured it. Elena screamed, shielding her eyes and retreating into the deepest shadows. The Hollowed in the courtyard below began to smoke, their gray skin curling like burning paper. But in the center of the beam stood Clara and Silas. Clara felt the heat. It was blinding, agonizing, and beautiful. She felt the black residue of the curse on her hands beginning to glow gold. She reached around and grabbed Silas's clawed hands, lacing her fingers through his. "Let go of the king, Silas," she whispered into his ear. "Just be the man." Under the searing touch of the sun and the raw power of the heart-bound tether, the obsidian shell shattered. It didn't turn to ash, it turned to light. The black veins on Silas's skin were forced out, evaporating into the air. His elongated form shrank back, the monstrous talons receding into human fingers that gripped Clara's with desperate strength. The central conflict, the curse of the Vanderbilt line, was being solved not by a blade but by a surrender. Silas Vanderbilt was choosing to die as a king so he could live as a man. The light intensified until the entire tower was a pillar of fire. For a moment, Clara felt her soul stretching, reaching across the void to find the pieces of Silas that had been lost for 300 years. She saw his memories, the burning roses, the faces of those he'd lost, and she pulled them all into the warmth. When the light finally dimmed, the tower was silent. The hollowed were gone, leaving behind nothing but piles of harmless gray dust in the wind. The council's guards had fled. In the center of the room, Silas lay on the floor, his head in Clara's lap. His eyes were open, clear, vibrant amber, free of the swirl of grief. He was breathing. Really breathing. "You did it," he whispered, his voice human and shaking with awe. "The tether. It didn't drain you. It changed me." Clara smiled through her tears, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I told you I wasn't a victim, Silas." But as they looked toward the doorway, they saw Julian standing guard, his face grim. "The hollowed are gone, but Elena still lives. And the council will never let a human man keep the Vanderbilt crown. We have to move. Now." Hope was restored and their love was deeper than ever, but the final confrontation was still to come. They had the key, but they still had to escape the lock. The air in the tower was no longer stagnant. It felt charged with the electricity of a world reborn. Silas stood, leaning on Clara for a brief moment before finding his own strength. A strength that was different now, lighter and more grounded. He looked at his hands, seeing the warmth of blood beneath the surface for the first time in centuries. But there was no time for wonder. The sound of heavy, rhythmic boots echoed up the spiral staircase. Elena Thorne had not fled the city. She had rallied the remaining loyalists of the Vampire Council. "They won't just let us walk away," Silas said, his voice regaining its command, though the predatory edge had been replaced by a sharp human urgency. "To the Council, a mortal Vanderbilt is a liability. A hole in the fabric of their power. Then we show them that the hole is actually a doorway," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a newfound fire. The doors to the Solaris Tower were kicked open, but it wasn't the hollowed who entered. It was Elena, flanked by 6 elite council enforcers. They wore armor of black and silver and carried pikes tipped with sunglass. Elena's violet eyes were wild with a mixture of terror and fanatical rage. "Look at you," Elena hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "A legend reduced to a heartbeat. You have betrayed 300 years of dominance for a girl who will be dust in 60 years. You are not a king. You are a carcass." "I am the first Vanderbilt to be free, Elena," Silas countered, stepping forward to shield Clara. "Free?" Elena laughed, a high, brittle sound. "You are vulnerable. And I will not let the Vanderbilt estate fall into the hands of a human scholar and her pet ghost. If the king is dead, then the matriarch shall rise." As Elena signaled the enforcers to charge, Clara realized the final mystery. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the black rose. Under the touch of the sunlight earlier, it hadn't just changed color. It had started to bloom. Its petals were no longer black or gray. They were a translucent crystalline red, pulsing with the same rhythm as her own heart. "Julian!" Clara called out. Julian's Sterling moved like a shadow. He didn't attack the enforcers. Instead, he used his sabers to strike the remaining mirrors in the room. "The final twist, Elena," he shouted. The power wasn't in the bloodline. It was in the willingness to give it back. As the glass shattered, Clara threw the rose into the center of the room. At the same moment, Silas reached out his hand and Clara took it. The heartbound tether flared one last time, acting as a conductor for the residual solar energy stored in the tower's gold-veined walls. The resulting explosion of light wasn't destructive to life, but it was anathema to the ancient, stagnant magic the council relied on. The enforcers' pikes shattered. Elena's blue gown began to fray into ash. The climactic resolution was a collision of the old world's greed and the new world's sacrifice. Silas moved then, not with the blur of a monster, but with the precision of a man who had mastered every art of combat. He didn't use fangs, he used the environment. He disarmed the first enforcer, using the man's own momentum to send him spiraling into the shadows. He moved with a heroic, authentic grace that made the vampires hesitate. They were used to fighting a beast. They didn't know how to fight a man who had nothing left to fear. Claire meanwhile faced Elena. The vampire matriarch lunged for her, her fingers hooked into claws. "You destroyed everything." "I gave him a choice," Clara shouted, sidestepping the attack. She grabbed a fallen silver sconce and held it steady. "You think power is about staying untouchable. But the most powerful thing in this room is the fact that he's willing to die for me, and I'm willing to live for him." Silas stepped between them, his hand catching Elena's wrist. The touch, once cold, now burned her with the purity of his reclaimed humanity. Elena shrieked, her form flickering as the stolen centuries of her life began to catch up with her. "The council is over, Elena," Silas said, his voice a calm, steady tolling bell. "Go back to the shadows before the sun finishes what the rose started." Defeated and broken by the sheer radiance of their connection, Elena Thorne and her followers retreated into the crumbling depths of the citadel. They were shadows fleeing the noonday sun. Silas turned to Clara. The most satisfying twist wasn't just that they survived. It was that the curse had been truly broken. The Heartbound wasn't a death sentence. It was a bridge that allowed Silas to share Clara's mortality, and in exchange he gave her a love that had been refined by 3 centuries of waiting. The tower was quiet. The threat was gone. Silas looked at the sunrise. Really looked at it, his eyes no longer stinging. He turned to the viewers of our story and with a soft, genuine smile he whispered, "It's a beautiful morning, isn't it? Before we see the final sunrise of this journey, I have a quick question for you all. What would you sacrifice for a love that felt destiny-bound? Let me know in the comments, and if this story has touched your heart, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next adventure." The dust from the shattered mirrors settled like glitter over the stone floor of the Solaris Tower. As the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the citadel in a warm, golden glow, the atmosphere of dread that had choked the kingdom for centuries finally evaporated. Clara and Silas stood at the balcony watching the city below begin to wake, not in fear of a silent king but in the peace of a new era. The transition from a ruler of shadows to a man of substance was complete. Silas looked down at his hands, marveling at the simple human sensation of the wind on his skin. He was no longer the vampire king. He was Silas, a man with a future that had an ending, and because it had an ending, every second now had a purpose. He had grown from a stagnant, grieving monument of the past into a person capable of building a tomorrow. "I spent 300 years memorizing the names of the dead," Silas whispered, turning to Clara with a look of profound peace. "I think I'd like to spend the next 50 learning the names of the living. Starting with yours, every single day." Clara took his hand, her heart full of a quiet, triumphant joy. He had changed too. No longer the invisible girl hiding in the dust of libraries, she had become the architect of a revolution. She had looked into the eyes of a monster and seen the man worth saving, and in doing so she had found her own strength. Julian Sterling joined them on the balcony, his sabers sheathed and a look of immense relief on his face. "The council has disbanded and Elena has gone into exile. The people don't know exactly what happened up here but they feel the change. They're calling it the Day of the Bright Heart." He smiled at Clara. "The library is waiting for you, Clara. But I suspect you'll be doing more than just cataloging now." "We have a lot of work to do," Clara agreed, leaning her head against Silas's shoulder. "There are stories in this citadel that need to be told, not as warnings but as history." The romantic bond between them was no longer a frantic tether of survival. It was a steady, grounding flame. They had earned this peace. The curse was a memory and the heart-bound connection had evolved into a simple, beautiful partnership. Silas's cold exterior had melted away, leaving behind a heart that beat with a passion far more powerful than any ancient magic. As the camera of our minds pulls back from the high spire of the tower, we see the city below bustling with life. The dark roses in the garden are being replaced with vibrant, living blooms. There is a sense of new beginnings in every corner of the realm. All the loose ends of the Vanderbilt legacy have been tied up, not with blood, but with the gold thread of a choice made in love. Thank you so much for staying with us through this emotional journey of The Vampire's Secrets, Heartbound. Seeing Clara and Silas find their way through the darkness to this beautiful, peaceful resolution reminds us all that no matter how ancient the shadow, the light always finds a crack. We are so grateful for your presence here. May your own stories be filled with hope, love, and the courage to break your own cages. Until next time, stay heartbound to the things that matter.